In this video, I want to walk you through the instructions for the part 2 of Final Project. It has a lot of similarities to part 1. It is a historical journalism type of assignment, but the scenario is different and the source requirements are different. Also, as I pointed out in the other video, I'm making this for the spring 2022 intercession section of this class. So January 9th may not be the date that this thing is due in your class, so please do pay attention to the due date in your class. It might differ. All right. Also, I will have to erase this instructions and details coming soon because I put those up. So what we're focusing on here then is the history of women's suffrage in New Mexico. And of course, this is a larger national and international movement that women gained the vote mostly in the 20th century, but over a span of several decades. The United States was not the first to give women the vote. In the US, women got the vote out in Western territories and states before the whole nation. So they kind of the West led in that regard for a number of reasons. New Mexico, however, was not necessarily part of that trend because it was a territory. So not until 1912, when New Mexico gained statehood, was voting the significant thing that it became when citizens of New Mexico actually had the ability to vote for the governor, for example. That used to be an appointed position under the territorial government, or to vote for the president or for their congressmen and women. It was men at the time, but it soon became both as well. Once women got the vote, they became more involved in electoral politics as candidates too. So again, a major trend that we're looking at, but we're going to focus on what this looked like in New Mexico. So as before, this module is set up much the same as the part 1. The instructions are here. That's a Google Doc. The submission area is here. And then there is a self-assessment checklist. This one will be the final one for our course because this is due on the last day of the term, whichever moment you're taking this class. So again, that date will differ, but it's the last day of the term. All right, so I have opened the historical journalism instructions in a different tab, just so that we don't have to wait for the internet to catch up while I click on the version of this in Brightspace. This is, again, much the same assignment as the first one, except this time you're going to locate a relevant primary source and a credible secondary source. So you're not just looking for a secondary source, you're also going to be looking for a primary source. Part of the reason for this is just to get you involved with trying to see different repositories and places that primary source materials are located online. Much historical work has been digitized, meaning you can get to a lot of things that you used to have to go to an archive for just by going to the internet. And so we'll have a chance to look for some of that. And you'll also need to find a credible secondary source because the textbook doesn't have as much about this topic. And I'll say more about that in just a second. Once again, though, you'll be playing the role of a reporter. You will write a no more than 275 word article based on the scenario below. As I was kind of alluding to, this time you'll use 2 primary sources. One is provided for you and one secondary source. So you'll have to find one primary source and one secondary source. So the steps are very similar. Read and understand the scenario. Use the resources provided with the scenario and below it to locate one primary source in addition to the one provided and one relevant secondary source that is not the textbook. Read and take notes on the documents you've located and chosen. And again, think about the persona that you're taking on as you're writing, as a reporter, the kind of tone you'll use in your writing, and so on. All right, and then of course, use your notes to write this 250 to 275 word report that integrates your 3 sources and interprets the significance of the events you've studied. This time, the scenario is that you are a New York Times reporter assigned to visit New Mexico in 1920 to report on developments in the movement for women's suffrage in the state. So you're going to want to look for primary sources that are relevant to New Mexico specifically. It'll be really easy to find a bunch that are relevant to the U.S. women's suffrage movement, make sure it's relevant to New Mexico. And as I say here, there were several different movements in the 1910s during which women mobilized and advocated for the right to vote in New Mexico. Try to gain an understanding of those. So there's a timeline below to help with that, in order to write your report that explains how New Mexico became the 32nd state of the 36 required to ratify the Susan B. Anthony Women's Suffrage Amendment, or the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. All right, so to begin thinking about this, read this second half of the Loyalty Questioned section of the book, linked there. It talks about Nina Otero Warren and her efforts to lead women's suffrage in New Mexico, mentions a few other major players in New Mexico, but it was Otero Warren who helped push Governor Lara Solo to make women's suffrage not just part of the ratification process, to get him behind that, but also to get him to push for more rights for women within New Mexico itself. So not just suffrage for state and local level elections in New Mexico, because that was something that the government here could do on its own, but also for other types of rights for women. So she was very instrumental in that. I think I've already mentioned about you can't use the textbook as a source, and it's actually less helpful in this case. And you'll see what I mean by that when you read the linked section there. Once again, you will write your article in a Word document or similar, submitted in Brightspace. Be sure to list the sources you've used at the bottom of your article. This is a works cited type of section, and include full bibliographic information for the sources you've located through your own research. You can use any formatting style for that. Many of you used MLA or APA, depending on if you had experience with those. Whatever you know, use that. Historians use Chicago style. If you know that, that's great. And if you're wanting to go into history, that's awesome. But again, if that's not the one that you use most for whatever your major is or what your experience is, don't worry about it. As long as you have the full publication information, author, title, date, you'll probably want to include a link because most of these will be web-based sources, that kind of thing. All right, so the primary source that is provided for you is this one here, Octaviano Lara Solo's message to the New Mexico State Legislature, January 1919. So I have it, I could open it. I don't think I'll want to do that just because I don't want to wait for it to open. But there, it's a transcription of the section of his message to the legislature that had to do with women's suffrage. So that's your jumping off point along with this section of the textbook. So what you're going to do at this point, after you've read all these things and you're thinking about how women's suffrage came to New Mexico, you're wanting to look for primary sources that might have something to do with someone like Nina Otero Warren, maybe Aurora Lucero. There are a few other people, Jesusita Peralt, and names that are escaping me right now. But you can use those as search terms as you are looking for primary sources. So you might not want to put just generally, I mean, you can try it to start, but women's suffrage in New Mexico as your search terms or something. But you can make it more specific based on what you've been reading and what you've learned. You can look for a specific detail of the story that you want to learn more about. Here are a few repositories for that. The Chronicling America website is historic newspapers that have been digitized and are housed at the Library of Congress. The Albuquerque Historical Society has some source documents included in their website. New Mexico Archives Online, so you can search there for some digitized materials on this period in our history. And if you do just a general Google search, you can, of course, do that. But be sure to verify the source's provenance. In short, that means where it came from, so you can verify this is a legit, for real historical source. If you click here on provenance, that'll open a document that explains a little bit more detail what archivists and historians look for when they're thinking about a source's provenance. Here's the timeline that I mentioned, just to give you not just New Mexico, but also a few national major turning points in this movement as well. And then, of course, the notes and tips as before, link to primary and secondary sources section of the textbook if you need a refresher on that, the SIFT method to help you think about how to evaluate sources and so on. And then finally, the evaluation rubric. Once again, could be hard to read in this format. You can make it larger with the Zoom capability in your browser, or you can click here on evaluation rubric to see it much larger. Okay, so hopefully that's helpful. As always, and with everything, let me know how I can help, what questions you have, and I look forward to reading your work on women's suffrage in New Mexico.